So we're using the template-driven forms management approach here. And for a start, we registered two input elements with help of ng-model. But currently, we don't have any way of accessing this form that's handled by Angular. And we have no way of getting hold or getting access to these input elements that we registered with Angular. Well, we can change that, because we can now add a template variable to this form and give it any name of your choice, like form, but the name is up to you. Now, we did something like that earlier in the course already, and if you do that, you would get access to the HTML form element. So to the DOM object that is created behind the scenes for this form HTML element. Here, however, I want to get access to this form object that will be created and managed by Angular behind the scenes, because Angular will actually also detect that you have a form element in your template if you are importing this forms module, because that's something else this module will do. It essentially registers a directive that has this form element selector as a selector so that Angular can control form elements like this. And Angular also gives us a syntax, a special syntax we can use on those template variables to store some other kind of value in that variable, instead of that default value, which would be stored by default. So instead of storing this HTML form element. Because you can assign a value to a template variable like this, but the value assigned here is then not the value that would be stored in there, but instead it can be some special identifier that might be exposed by some directive or component that then binds this template variable to some other value than the default value. In this case, since I'm adding the form template variable on the form element, which, as I just explained, is managed by Angular under the hood, thanks to this directive that is provided by the forms module, if I'm doing that, I can use the ngForm identifier here. That's a special identifier offered by Angular, offered by its form directive, which will now bind this form template variable to an object of type ngForm, which is an object created and managed by Angular, as you can tell by its name, starting with ng. And that is now that form object that is automatically created behind the scenes by Angular, and it's this behind the scenes managed forms object to which these inputs are registered if you add ng-model on them. So therefore now this form template variable stores this Angular managed form. And you can probably tell why this approach is called the template-driven approach, because I'm doing all that setup work here in the template. I registered these inputs in the template, and I got access to that Angular managed form here in the template. But now we can ensure that we also get access to this form in our component class here by either getting hold of this element with help of the viewChild function or decorator, as you learned it before in the course, or by passing this variable onto some method that may be executed when the form is submitted. And I'll do the latter here. I'll add this ng-submit event handler, about which you learned earlier in the course already, which is another forms-related feature offered by Angular. And I then want to trigger some onSubmit method and pass my form variable here as an argument to onSubmit. So therefore, in the login component, we can and should now add this onSubmit method. And there I expect to get a parameter, and I'll name it form here as well, though this name here doesn't need to be the same name as I chose here, but I will go for form here as well. And the type of this parameter will be ngForm, which must be imported from @AngularForms. And we can tell that we'll get an argument of this type if we go back to the template and we hover over this template variable. There we learned that it will be of type ngForm. And since I'm passing that to onSubmit, we'll get a parameter of that type as an input there in this method. Well, and now I'll simply log it to the console so that we can see what's inside of such a ngForm object. So what's inside of this behind the scenes Angular managed forms object. Therefore, if I save that all and I then enter some values here and I click login, you'll see this object gets logged here. And if we expand it, we can see that it's definitely a more complex object, which we haven't created, but which instead was created by Angular. And you can tell that it's an object that has a form key, for example, a property named form, which holds another object of type form group. And we can expand that as well, and we see that such a form group then contains some controls, an errors key, which at the moment is null, then some other properties that, for example, tell us that it's not a pristine form anymore, so that it has been touched by the user, that it has been changed by the user. And we also got a value property, which is an object that has two keys that match the names we chose here in the template. And that's, of course, no coincidence. Instead, the names you chose here are the names of these values here, because these values are populated and set by the ngModel directive in the end. So this ngModel directive works together with this form directive that's provided by Angular. So that proves that these inputs were registered with this form, because of course there I also find the values I just entered. Alternatively, we could have also expanded this controls property here, which also holds an object which has one key value pair per input we registered, where we also again find our names, and then we see that they're of type form control in the end. And then for every input, we got some detailed information, like the value that was entered, but then also on a per input level, whether it's valid, whether it has been touched by the user, and so on. And that's the kind of advanced form management you can get from Angular when using these template-driven forms features here. And as you can tell, getting started with template-driven forms therefore isn't difficult at all. You just use a form element, and then you have some input elements in there, and you add ngModel and a name to these input elements, and that's essentially it. Then you can get hold of that form like this here, with help of this special variable and this special syntax, and you can then use it in any way you want. And speaking of that, we will now use it in different ways to get a feeling for what we can do with such an Angular managed form. So, as we can see, Angular does set up and manage quite a complex form object for our template-driven form here. And it does that all automatically because we in the end only registered these inputs and did nothing else, and Angular did all the heavy lifting. Now, we can use this form object to extract the entered values with help of the value property here, for example. But we can also use it for validation and for rejecting invalid values. Now let's start by extracting the entered values first though. I'll rename my parameter here to form data, because as we can see, there actually is a property named form in that object that is created by Angular, and I don't want to write form.form here, so that's why I renamed the parameter to form data. And then we can access this form object with .form, and there we can get hold of the values with .value. And here we can then use .email to get hold of the entered email address, or .password to get hold of the entered password. So here I could get my entered email by extracting it like this. And of course, the entered password can be extracted like that. Alternatively, we could of course also still use two-way binding. Just to be very clear about that, we could still use two-way binding here and we would still get that Angular managed form object. So if you prefer to get hold of the entered values with help of two-way binding, you can absolutely still do that. But here I don't want to use two-way binding. Instead, I'll extract those entered values only when the form is submitted with help of this Angular created form object. And therefore now here we can of course console log entered email and entered password like this. And if we do that, then hopefully unsurprisingly, if I enter some values here and I click login, they are being logged here. So that's how we can extract values with help of that form object that's created by Angular. Next, let's make sure that we also add some validation here and we make sure that invalid values can't be submitted.